When 18-year-old Barron Trump spotted a homeless woman in Central Park, he never expected to recognize her face. But there she was, Mrs. Henderson, his favorite fourth-grade teacher. The woman who had taught him multiplication through silly songs and stood up for him when other kids teased him about his famous last name. Now, she was living on a park bench, clutching a mysterious notebook, and looking over her shoulder like someone was watching her. What began as a simple act of kindness, trying to help a former teacher in need, quickly pulled Barron into a dangerous web of secrets. Why did Mrs. Henderson go from teaching at prestigious schools to living on the streets? What was she writing in that notebook? And why did she seem more scared of being found than of being homeless? The truth would turn out to be more incredible than anything Barron could have imagined. Sometimes the people who shape our childhood aren't quite who they seem, and the biggest acts of courage often go unnoticed until they change everything. The morning frost made Barron Trump's breath come out in little white puffs as he walked through Central Park. He pulled his coat tighter around his tall frame, grateful for its warmth on this chilly autumn day. At 18, he often took these early morning walks to clear his head before his college classes started. The park was quiet except for the crunch of leaves under his feet and the distant sound of early traffic. Joggers passed by in their bright athletic gear, and a few dog walkers nodded hello. It felt like a normal morning until it wasn't. As he walked past a row of benches near the duck pond, something made him slow down. Later, he would wonder if it was fate or just chance that made him notice her. Among the handful of homeless people huddled on the benches, one person caught his eye. There was something familiar about the way she held her head, even though it was bent down, focusing on what looked like an old notebook in her lap. Barron stopped walking. His heart started beating faster as memories flooded back. Memories of a classroom filled with sunlight and the smell of chalk dust, of kind words when he struggled with math, of a warm smile that made him feel like he could do anything. "Mrs. Henderson?" he whispered, then louder. "Mrs. Henderson?" The woman looked up, and Barron felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. Her face was thinner now, with deep lines around her eyes. Her once neat brown hair was streaked with gray and tangled. But those eyes, those were the same gentle eyes that had watched over him in fourth grade. She squinted at him, confusion crossing her face. "Do I know you?" Barron stepped closer, his expensive shoes crunching on the frosty grass. "It's me, Mrs. Henderson. Barron Trump. From your fourth-grade class at Columbia Grammar?" Recognition slowly dawned in her eyes, followed quickly by something else. Was it fear? Barron. Little Barron, who couldn't remember his multiplication tables. Her voice was hoarse, but he could still hear traces of the warmth he remembered. "That's right," he said, smiling even as his chest ached. "You helped me learn them by making up those funny songs. Remember? 8 times 8 fell on the floor, picked it up, and got 64. A small smile crossed her face, but it disappeared just as quickly. She clutched her notebook tighter and pulled her thin jacket around her shoulders. "You've grown so tall," she said softly. Barron had 1,000 questions racing through his mind. How had this happened? Why was his favorite teacher, the woman who had once worn crisp blouses and pearl earrings, sitting on a park bench with all her belongings in a worn backpack beside her? "Mrs. Henderson, are you okay?" It was a stupid question, but he didn't know what else to say. "Oh, I'm fine, dear. Just fine." She waved her hand dismissively, but Barron noticed how it trembled. Life takes unexpected turns sometimes, that's all. "But look at you! All grown up and in college now, I expect?" "Yes, ma'am. NYU." He paused, then added, Because of you, actually. Remember when you told me I could be anything I wanted? That I shouldn't just do what other people expected? Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. You always were a special student, Barron. So kind, so thoughtful. A gust of cold wind blew across the park, and Mrs. Henderson shivered. Without thinking, Barron started to take off his coat. No, no, she said firmly, holding up her hand. Keep your coat. I'm perfectly fine. But she wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. Barron remembered how she had stayed late after school to help him with his homework, how she'd defended him when other kids teased him about his famous last name, how she'd shown up at his science fair, even though she had the flu that day. Let me help you, he said, reaching for his wallet. I can get you a hotel room, some food. No! The sharpness in her voice startled him. She stood up quickly, shoving her notebook into her backpack. I mean, no thank you, Barron. It was wonderful to see you, but I need to go now. But Mrs. Henderson, please. Some things are better left alone, she said, her voice shaking. Promise me something, Barron. Promise me you won't tell anyone you saw me. Not your parents. Not anyone. Can you do that? Before he could answer, she had shouldered her backpack and was hurrying away down the path, leaving Barron standing there with his hand still outstretched. He watched until she disappeared around a bend in the trail, his mind spinning with questions. Why had she reacted so strongly to his offer of help? What was in that notebook she'd been writing in? And why did she seem more scared than happy to see him? Barron looked down at the bench where she had been sitting. Something caught his eye, a small scrap of paper that must have fallen from her notebook. He picked it up, but before he could read what was written on it, his phone buzzed with a text from his mother asking where he was. He carefully folded the paper and put it in his pocket. As he turned to head home, he made a decision. He might have promised not to tell anyone he'd seen Mrs. Henderson, but he hadn't promised not to help her. And Barron Trump kept his promises, especially to the teacher who had taught him the importance of doing what was right, no matter how hard it might be. Barron couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Mrs. Henderson's face. Not the happy, confident teacher from his memories, but the scared woman from the park. The piece of paper from her notebook seemed to burn in his pocket, but he hadn't looked at it yet. Something told him that once he did, there would be no turning back. Finally, at 3 in the morning, he sat up in bed and turned on his lamp. His room at the family's Manhattan apartment was warm and comfortable, making him feel guilty when he thought about Mrs. Henderson out in the cold. He took out the crumpled paper and carefully smoothed it on his desk. His hands shook as he read the hurried handwriting. Miller Street School. Fire, June 15th. Must keep moving. The words didn't make much sense, but they sent a chill down his spine. He grabbed his laptop and opened Google, typing Miller Street School fire into the search bar. Several news articles popped up, dated 3 years ago. A suspicious fire had destroyed the elementary school's records room. No one was hurt, but important documents were lost forever. What were you involved in, Mrs. Henderson? Barron whispered to himself. He spent the next few hours digging deeper. Mrs. Henderson, Sarah Henderson, he discovered, had left Columbia Grammar shortly after his 4th grade year. The school's website said she had resigned for personal reasons. But when he looked further, he found something strange. She had worked at 5 different schools in the past 10 years, never staying more than 2 years at each one. The sun was rising when Barron finally found an article that made his heart skip. It was from a small newspaper in New Jersey. Local teacher's husband dies in tragic accident. The article mentioned Sarah Henderson and included a photo of her standing next to a kind-looking man with gray hair. According to the story, David Henderson had died during the early days of COVID, and medical bills had bankrupted his widow. That explains some of it, Barron muttered, rubbing his tired eyes. But it didn't explain everything. Why was she so afraid? Why did she keep moving from school to school? And what did the fire at Miller Street School have to do with anything? He opened a new document and started making a timeline. 2014 to 2016. Teaches at Columbia Grammar, his school, 2016 to 2018. Riverdale Elementary, 2018 to 2020, Miller Street School. Fire in records room. 2020, husband dies. COVID hits 2021 to 2022. 2. More schools. Both brief stays 2023 to present. Homeless in Central Park. There were gaps in the timeline, periods where he couldn't find any trace of her. It was as if she disappeared completely for months at a time. And something else bothered him. In each school's staff photos, she looked different. Sometimes her hair was blonde, sometimes brown. She wore glasses in some pictures, but not others. It was like she was trying to change her appearance. Barron's phone buzzed, making him jump. It was a text from his mother. "Breakfast in 15 minutes, darling. Don't be late for class." He looked at the mess of papers and notes spread across his desk. He had class in 2 hours, but there was something he needed to do first. He dressed quickly, grabbed his backpack, and headed out, telling his mother he needed to stop at the library before class. Instead, he went to the park. The morning was warmer than yesterday, and more people were out. He walked to the bench where he'd found Mrs. Henderson, but she wasn't there. He spent an hour searching nearby areas where homeless people often gathered, but there was no sign of her. A street vendor was setting up his coffee cart nearby. Barron bought a cup and casually asked, "Hey, have you seen an older woman around?" "Here? Gray-streaked hair, carries a notebook?" The vendor nodded. "The teacher?" "Yeah, she's been around a few months. Real quiet, polite lady. Always writing in that notebook of hers. Broke my heart when she told me she used to be a teacher." "Do you know where she goes during the day?" The vendor shook his head. "She moves around a lot. Sometimes I see her at the public library on 5th. Says she likes to stay warm and read the newspapers there." Barron checked his phone. He had just enough time to stop at the library before class. The library was just opening when he arrived. He walked through the quiet rooms, scanning the tables and reading areas. Finally, in a corner behind the reference section, he spotted a familiar figure hunched over a newspaper. He was about to approach when he noticed what section she was reading. Old newspaper archives, and there, spread out on the table in front of her, were articles about the Miller Street School fire. But these weren't the same articles he'd found online. These showed something different, something that made his blood run cold. In one photo, barely visible in the background behind the firefighters, was a face he recognized. It was younger, but he was sure it was the same person. It was him. 13-year-old Barron Trump, standing in the crowd at a school he'd never attended. His phone buzzed again. He was late for class. But as he hurried out of the library, his mind was racing. Why was he in that photo? He had no memory of ever being at Miller Street School. What else didn't he remember? And what did Mrs. Henderson know about it? He was so lost in thought that he almost missed it. The black sedan parked across from the library, with 2 men in dark suits watching the entrance. They looked official, like government agents or security personnel. One of them was speaking into a phone, and as Barron passed by, he caught a few words. "Subject located. What are your orders regarding the boy?" Barron's heart pounded as he forced himself to keep walking at a normal pace. Who were those men? And why were they watching? The library? He waited until he was around the corner before pulling out his phone. His hands trembled as he opened his banking app and made a quick calculation. The trust fund his father had set up for him had plenty of money, and he had access to some of it now that he was 18. It wasn't his whole plan, but it was a start. He skipped his morning classes and went straight to Work and Stay, a nonprofit organization that helped homeless people find temporary housing. The lady at the front desk looked up from her computer as he approached. "Hi," Barron said, trying to sound confident. "I'd like to reserve a room for someone, a former teacher of mine." 20 minutes and several forms later, Barron had secured a small but clean room in a supervised shelter. It had a private bathroom, 3 meals a day, and most importantly, security at the entrance. He made sure his name wasn't on any of the paperwork. Finding Mrs. Henderson again took most of the afternoon. He finally spotted her sitting on a different bench, this time near the zoo. She was writing in her notebook again, her hand moving quickly across the page. "Mrs. Henderson," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She jumped anyway, quickly, closing the notebook. "Barron, I told you to stay away." "I know, but I also know you need help." He sat down beside her, keeping his voice low. "I saw the men watching the library." Her face went pale. "You followed me. I was worried about you, and I found the article about your husband. I'm so sorry." Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears. "David was a good man. He never knew, never understood why we had to keep moving." "I have a safe place for you to stay," Barron said quickly, before she could run away again. "It's a private room in a shelter with good security. No one will know you're there except me." "I don't deserve your help," she whispered, clutching her notebook. "If you knew, then tell me. Help me understand why I was in that photo at Miller Street School." Mrs. Henderson's head snapped up. "What photo?" "I saw it in the library archives. I was there the day of the fire, wasn't I? But I don't remember it." She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her worn shoes. Finally, she spoke so softly, Barron had to lean in to hear. "Some things are better left forgotten." "Please," Barron said, pulling out the shelter information. "At least come see the room. You can't stay out here in the cold. And," he hesitated, then added, "I saw your notebook at the library. I know you're investigating something. Maybe having a safe place would help." Mrs. Henderson looked at the shelter information, then at Barron's face. He could see her weighing her options, probably thinking about those men in the black sedan. "One night," she finally said. "I'll stay one night." Barron helped her gather her few belongings and took her to the shelter. The room was small but warm, with a real bed and clean sheets. Mrs. Henderson ran her hand over the blanket, like she couldn't believe it was real. "Thank you," she said quietly, setting her backpack down. "But Barron, you have to promise me something else. If anyone asks about me, anyone at all, you don't know where I am. Even if they say they're trying to help. Even if they say I'm in danger." "I promise," Barron said. "But you have to promise me something too. Promise you'll still be here tomorrow when I come back." She gave him a sad smile, but didn't answer. As he turned to leave, he noticed she had opened her notebook again. Just before the door closed, he caught a glimpse of what she was writing. "The boy must never know what really happened that day. The truth would destroy everything we sacrificed to protect." The door clicked shut before he could read more. That night. Barron couldn't stop thinking about those last words in Mrs. Henderson's notebook. What were they protecting him from? He sat at his computer, diving deeper into her past than ever before. This time, he looked beyond just her teaching career. He searched for Sarah Henderson's life before she became his teacher, and what he found made him sit up straight in his chair. An article from 15 years ago showed a different Sarah Henderson. She stood on the steps of a beautiful house, wearing expensive clothes and jewelry, next to her husband, David. The caption read, "Local business couple donates $1 million grant to Children's Hospital." They were rich, Barron whispered to himself. He kept reading. The Hendersons had owned a BDE successful consulting firm. They lived in a mansion. They went to charity galas. Then, suddenly, everything changed. In 2013, their company closed without explanation. The mansion was sold. David Henderson took a job as an insurance salesman, and Sarah started teaching. A year later, she was at Columbia Grammar, teaching Barron's 4th grade class. But something else caught his eye. In each school where she taught, she used slightly different names. Columbia Grammar, Sarah Henderson. Riverdale Elementary, Sarah H. Anderson. Miller Street, School, Sandra Henderson. After that, Sarah Hendricks, Sally Anderson. It was like she was trying to hide, but not completely. Like she wanted to be found by the right person. Barron's phone buzzed. A text from the shelter. Mrs. Henderson had eaten dinner and was safe in her room. He breathed a sigh of relief, but his questions only grew. He decided to visit the public records office first thing in the morning. Sleep could wait. The records clerk barely looked up when Barron walked in the next day. He searched through property records, business licenses, and old tax documents. Most of it was boring, until he found something strange. 2 weeks before the Hendersons' company closed, they had transferred a large sum of money to a series of offshore accounts. The same week, David Henderson had rented a safety deposit box at First National Bank. Barron's hands shook as he read the document. The safety deposit box was still active. David Henderson had paid for 20 years in advance. And there, at the bottom of the form, was a note. Secondary access granted to Sarah Henderson. He rushed to the bank, hoping it would still be open. The banker listened patiently as Barron explained that he was trying to help Mrs. Henderson. "I'm sorry, young man," the banker said, "but we can't give you any information about our clients' safety deposit boxes." "Could you at least tell me if she's ever accessed it?" The banker hesitated. "That would be confidential, but..." She lowered her voice. "If someone were concerned about Mrs. Henderson, they might want to know that no one has accessed that box in almost 10 years. Barron thanked her and left, his mind racing. There was something important in that box, something worth protecting for 10 years, something that might explain why Mrs. Henderson went from living in a mansion to hiding on park benches. He hurried back to the shelter, but when he got there, his heart stopped. The security guard was talking to 2 men in dark suits. The same men from the library. Barron ducked behind a column and pulled out his phone. He texted Mrs. Henderson, "Don't leave your room. Men in suits here. Looking for you?" Her reply came seconds later. "Back window. Fire escape. Meet me at the carousel in 30 minutes. Bring laptop." He watched as the men showed badges to the security guard. They looked official, FBI maybe, or some other government agency. But Mrs. Henderson was more scared of them than of being homeless. "One more thing," the guard was saying. "She had a visitor yesterday, tall young man, well-dressed." One of the men pulled out a photo. Was it this person? Barron couldn't see the photo, but he could guess who it showed. His phone buzzed again with another text from Mrs. Henderson. "If you come, your life will change forever. Last chance to walk away. But if you want the truth about the fire and why you were there, bring the laptop and an open mind." Through the glass doors, Barron saw the men heading toward the elevator. In his pocket, he felt the folded scrap of paper from her notebook. On his phone screen, her warning glowed ominously. He had to make a choice. Now. Barron ran, not away from the situation, but toward it. He sprinted 3 blocks to his apartment, grabbed his laptop, and rushed to Central Park. His heart pounded as he approached the carousel, its cheerful music a strange contrast to the tension he felt. Mrs. Henderson was already there, wearing a different coat than before, probably borrowed from the shelter. Her hair was tucked under a hat, and she wore sunglasses despite the cloudy day. She looked like a different person. "You came," she said, sounding both relieved and worried. "Did anyone follow you?" "No, I was careful." Barron looked around nervously. "Mrs. Henderson, who were those men? FBI?" She shook her head. "U.S. Marshals. I used to be in witness protection, but I left the program." Barron felt like the ground was shifting under his feet. Witness protection. But why? Because I saw something I shouldn't have. Something that could have brought down very powerful people. She glanced over her shoulder. "The same thing you saw that day at Miller Street School. Though you were too young to understand it. But I don't remember being there." "That's because they made sure you wouldn't." She touched his arm gently. "Barron, what I'm about to tell you will change everything. Are you sure you want to know?" He nodded, thinking about the photograph in the archives, the safety deposit box, the mysterious fire. "Your father had enemies," she began. "People who wanted to destroy him, who would use anything, or anyone, against him, including his young son." "What do you mean?" "You were 13. You were supposed to be at a friend's house studying, but you'd actually gone to Miller Street School to meet your first girlfriend for a secret date." A small smile crossed her face. "Young love, but what you saw there that day..." She stopped suddenly, her head turning sharply. "We need to move. Now." Barron followed her gaze and saw a black sedan turning into the park. They hurried away from the carousel, walking quickly, but trying not to run. "The school was being used after hours," Mrs. Henderson continued as they walked, "by people who were planning something terrible. You saw them, saw what they were preparing. You didn't understand it all, but you knew it was wrong." They ducked into a crowded shopping area. Mrs. Henderson led them through a department store, then out a side exit. "I was there because I was already working with the FBI," she said. "Deep undercover. When I saw you, I had to make a choice. Let you become part of the investigation. Put you and your whole family at risk, or what? Or protect you. Make sure you didn't remember. Help you forget that day. Then keep watching over you to make sure you stayed safe. That's why you became my teacher?" She nodded. "I gave up witness protection to stay close, to make sure they never found you." David understood. He gave up everything, too. Our company, our home, our life, all to protect a little boy we didn't even know. Barron felt dizzy. But now they're back. Why? Because someone talked. Someone remembered seeing you there. And now they're afraid that you'll remember, too. She stopped walking and faced him. "That's why I've been running again. As long as I'm out there, they'll focus on finding me instead of you. They think I have proof of what happened that day." "Do you?" Mrs. Henderson patted her notebook. "I have something better. I have the truth. But the truth is dangerous, Barron. That's why I've been writing it all down little by little. If something happens to me, someone needs to know." A voice crackled from nearby, a police radio. Mrs. Henderson's face went pale. "They're closing in," she whispered. "Barron, you need to go. Now. Forget about me. Forget about all of this. No, he said firmly. You protected me all these years. Now, it's my turn to protect you. He pulled out his phone, ready to call for help. But before he could dial, he saw Mrs. Henderson's eyes go wide with fear. He turned around slowly. 3 U.S. Marshals stood behind them, badges out. Mrs. Henderson, one said, "It's time to come back into the program." But Barron noticed something strange about their badges, something that made his blood run cold. The dates were wrong. "Those badges are fake," Barron whispered to Mrs. Henderson. "The issue dates, they're from next year." Mrs. Henderson's hand tightened on his arm. "Run," she breathed. But before they could move, more men appeared behind them. They were trapped between the fake marshals and the newcomers. Barron tensed, ready to fight if he had to, but Mrs. Henderson suddenly relaxed. "Agent Phillips," she said to one of the newcomers, "it's been a long time." The man stepped forward, showing his badge. A real one this time. "Too long, Sarah. We've been looking for you." The fake marshals tried to run, but they were quickly caught by other FBI agents who seemed to appear from nowhere. As they were handcuffed, Barron noticed something else. They had the same symbol tattooed on their wrists, a small flame inside. A circle. "The people from the school," he said suddenly. "They had the same tattoo." Agent Phillips nodded. "You remember that detail? Interesting. Please, both of you come with us. We need to talk somewhere safe." They were taken to a small coffee shop that had been cleared of customers. As they sat in a back booth, Mrs. Henderson finally opened her notebook and laid it on the table. "I've been documenting everything," she said. "Every time they got close, every person they sent to find us. I knew someday we'd need proof." "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" Barron asked. "Because once you knew, you'd be in danger again. As long as you were truly innocent, truly unknowing, they couldn't touch you." She pushed the notebook toward Agent Phillips. "But now they know you're with me, so there's no point in hiding anymore." Agent Phillips flipped through the notebook. "This is incredible, Sarah. You've connected all the dots. The shell companies, the money transfers, the whole network." "What network?" Barron asked. "What did I really see that day?" Mrs. Henderson took a deep breath. "You saw members of an organization called the Phoenix Circle meeting in that school. They were planning to use schools across the country as fronts for money laundering. Billions of dollars of dirty money, cleaned through fake educational programs. This company David and I owned," she continued, "was going to be one of their main tools. When we refused to help them, they threatened us. But then you stumbled into one of their meetings." "The fire," Barron said slowly, memories starting to surface. "They said it to destroy evidence? Yes, but also to cover up what they did to you. They had a doctor there who specialized in memory manipulation. They couldn't risk killing you, too high profile. So they made you forget instead." Agent Phillips leaned forward. "We've been building a case against them for years, but we could never prove the connection between the schools and the money laundering. Your notebook changes everything, Sarah." Mrs. Henderson pulled an old photograph from the back of her notebook and handed it to Barron. It showed her and David standing in front of their old mansion, but in the background, barely visible through a window, was a young Barron Trump. "This was taken the day before everything changed," she said softly. "I kept it to remind me why. We gave up everything. David never regretted it, not even at the end." "But why?" Barron asked. "Why did you sacrifice so much for me?" Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears. "Because 20 years ago, I lost my own son. He was your age, After that, I promised myself I would never let another child be hurt if I could prevent it. Agent Phillips cleared his throat. We need to move you both to a safe location. The Phoenix Circle knows you're together now. They'll be desperate. No, more running, Mrs. Henderson said firmly. I'm tired of hiding. It's time to finish this. She pulled one more thing from her notebook. A small key. The safety deposit box, Barron said. She nodded. Everything we could prove, every document we could save, it's all there. David put it away right before they forced us into hiding. I never touched it because I knew they were watching the bank. But now... A commotion outside made them all look up. Through the coffee shop window, they could see more black sedans arriving. Agent Phillips stood quickly. Back door. Now. As they hurried through the kitchen, Barron grabbed Mrs. Henderson's hand. Whatever happens, we're in this together now. She squeezed his hand back. Together, she agreed. But as they reached the back alley, they heard a sound that made them freeze. Helicopter rotors getting closer. And on the wall ahead of them, someone had freshly painted a symbol, a flame inside a circle. Agent Phillips pulled out his gun. They're hurting us, he said quietly, making us go where they want us to go. The helicopter sound grew louder. Mrs. Henderson clutched her notebook tighter, her knuckles white. The bank, she whispered. They know about the safety deposit box. That's where they want us to go. Then we don't go there, Barron said firmly. But even as he said it, he noticed more Phoenix Circle symbols appearing, spray-painted on dumpsters, carved into doors, drawn in chalk on the ground, all pointing toward First National Bank. We might not have a choice, Agent Phillips said, touching his earpiece. They've blocked off every other street. My team is being held back by fake emergency vehicles. Mrs. Henderson straightened her shoulders. Maybe we should give them what they want. Mrs. Henderson? No, Barron protested. Listen to me, both of you, she said, her voice stronger than Barron had heard it in days. They think everything they need to worry about is in that safety deposit box, but it's not. She pulled out her phone and pressed a few buttons. I've been sending everything to a secure server. Every name, every document, every connection I've uncovered. It's all backed up. The notebook is just a decoy. Agent Phillips stared at her. You've been playing them this whole time? She gave a small, sad smile. I learned from the best. David always said to have a backup plan for your backup plan. The helicopter was right above them now, its searchlight sweeping the alley. Here's what we're going to do, Mrs. Henderson said, pulling something from her coat, a second notebook, identical to the first. Barron, take the real notebook and go with Agent Phillips. I'll take this fake one and head to the bank. No way, Barron said. I won't let you sacrifice yourself. I'm not sacrificing anything, she said softly. I'm finishing what David and I started, and I'm keeping my promise to protect you. One last time. Agent Phillips spoke urgently into his earpiece, then turned to them. Backup is 12 minutes out. If we're doing this, it has to be now. Mrs. Henderson handed the real notebook to Barron, then hugged him tightly. You were always more than just a student to me, she whispered. You were my second chance to save someone. And you did more than that. You saved me right back. Barron felt tears in his eyes. Please don't do this. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting, she said, stepping back. Sometimes it's letting others fight while you protect what's most important. She looked at Agent Phillips. Get him out of here. When backup arrives, tell them I've activated Protocol Sunrise. Agent Phillips's eyes widened. You're sure? She nodded. It's time to bring everything into the light. Before Barron could protest again, she turned and ran toward the street, clutching the fake notebook. The helicopter's spotlight followed her. Now! Agent Phillips grabbed Barron's arm and pulled him the opposite direction, through a hidden door in the alley wall. They emerged in a service tunnel under the city. As they ran through the dimly lit tunnel, Barron could hear sirens and helicopters above them. His phone buzzed. A final text from Mrs. Henderson. The Phoenix Circle dies in darkness, but truth lives in the light. When you're safe, open the real notebook. There's a letter inside just for you. Everything I never got to tell my own son, I wrote it all to you instead. Barron and Agent Phillips reached a subway maintenance room. As they caught their breath, Barron's phone buzzed again. This time it was a news alert. Breaking. Major FBI operation underway at First National Bank. Sources report a former teacher has exposed a $1 billion money laundering scheme. Arrests being made at multiple locations. He looked at Agent Phillips. What's Protocol Sunrise? It's when we activate every undercover agent, every piece of evidence, every witness, all at once, Phillips replied. You're Mrs. Henderson. She wasn't just running all these years. She was building a network, gathering allies, waiting for the perfect moment. Barron opened the real notebook with shaking hands. There, tucked inside the cover, was an envelope with his name on it. But before he could read it, Agent Phillips's radio crackled to life. All units be advised. Subject Sarah Henderson is... The radio cut off in a burst of static. Barron's heart stopped. We have to go back. Wait. Agent Phillips held up his hand. As the radio crackled again. Is in custody. Repeat. Sarah Henderson is in protective custody. Operation Sunrise successful. Phoenix Circle leadership arrested at the bank. They took the bait. Over. Barron sagged against the wall in relief. She was safe. They were all safe. Let's get you to headquarters, Agent Phillips said. Mrs. Henderson will meet us there. 2 hours later, Barron sat in a comfortable office. At the FBI building, the real notebook in his lap. Mrs. Henderson sat across from him, looking tired but proud. She'd changed into clean clothes, and for the first time since he'd found her in the park, she looked like the teacher he remembered. Read the letter, she said gently. It's time you knew everything. With trembling hands, Barron opened the envelope and began to read, Dear Barron, if you're reading this, then everything we worked for has finally happened. The Phoenix Circle is exposed and you're safe. But there's one last truth you need to know. That day at Miller Street School, you saw something, even worse than their money laundering. You saw them testing their memory manipulation technique on children. Poor kids, foster children, anyone they thought wouldn't be missed. They were practicing, perfecting their method. And you, with your 13-year-old's sense of justice, tried to save those children. You grabbed one of their files and ran, but they caught you. That's when I made the hardest choice of my life. I offered them a deal. I would join their organization as a teacher, help them move their money through schools, if they would let you go with just a memory wipe instead of hurting you. They agreed, but with a condition. I had to stay close to you, make sure the memory wipe held. What they didn't know was that this was exactly what David and I wanted, a way to protect you while gathering evidence against them. You see, my son Michael didn't just die 20 years ago. He was taken by the Phoenix Circle. He was their first memory manipulation victim, and it went wrong. So terribly wrong. When I saw you in that school, so brave and so much like him, I couldn't let it happen again. David understood. We gave up everything, our wealth, our safety, our identities, to become your protectors. Every school I worked at was another piece of evidence gathered. Every time we moved was another step in the plan. Even becoming homeless was strategic. They stopped watching me as carefully once they thought I'd hit rock bottom. But here's the most important thing. You were never just a mission to us. You became the second son I never thought I'd have. Every song I made up to help you learn multiplication, every science project I helped with, every time I defended you from bullies, that was all real. The Phoenix Circle thought they were making me watch you. They never realized I was watching them right back. You didn't just survive that day at Miller Street School, Barron. You started a chain of events that would save countless other children. Your bravery gave me the strength to finish what Michael's death started. I'm so proud of the young man you've become. And I know Michael would be proud too. With all my love, your teacher, Sarah. Barron looked up from the letter with tears in his eyes. Mrs. Henderson, Sarah, was crying too. All this time, he whispered, every math lesson, every parent-teacher conference was real, she finished. The best kind of undercover work is the kind where you don't have to pretend to care. Agent Phillips knocked on the door. Sorry to interrupt, but there's someone else here who wants to see you both. A tall man with gray hair entered the room. He walked with a cane and looked tired, but his eyes were kind and familiar. David? Sarah gasped. David Henderson smiled. You didn't think I'd really leave you to finish this alone, did you? But you died. The COVID. A cover story, David explained. When we got word the Phoenix Circle was getting suspicious, I died so I could work with the FBI full-time, coordinating all the undercover agents you were placing in schools. Sarah ran to him, and they held each other tightly. Barron watched them, feeling a mix of joy and awe. What happens now? He asked. Now, David said, we all go home. Our real home. The mansion's still there. The FBI kept it as a safe house all these years. And Sarah, he pulled back to look at his wife. Michael's case has been reopened. With the Phoenix Circle's files, we might finally learn exactly what happened. Sarah turned to Barron. Will you come with us? There's plenty of room, and I think we all have a lot of catching up to do. Barron smiled through his tears. I'd like that. But first, he held up the notebook. Don't we have some more bad guys to put away? Sarah laughed, a real, joyful laugh that erased years of worry from her face. Always thinking of others. You really are just like Michael. As they left the FBI building together, Barron thought about all the math songs, all the encouraging words, all the little moments that had seemed so normal at the time. His fourth-grade teacher had saved his life, and in doing so, had helped him save many others. Sometimes, he realized, the biggest heroes are the ones who pretend not to be heroes at all. Thank you for joining me for this incredible story about Barron Trump and his former teacher. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Drop your location in the comments below. Did this story touch your heart? Hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder that heroes can come from unexpected places. If you enjoyed this story of compassion and courage, you won't want to miss our next video. Big Shock gives his first-class seat to a struggling mother. Another touching story that shows how one simple act of kindness can change lives forever. Click the video on your screen now or find the link in the description. Thanks for watching.